당도 동화 세비게 탑 디기 주위에 탑되라 당아 주기 치 ngo벌레 때네 디기 주위에 동화 세야 직제 한낭 셈바스 교화다제 안에 아주 디기 주위에다 동화 세비에 탑람 니유베 나네당 아주 조셰디 낭 삼로 토네 교화다제 디기 주위에다 안에 동화 세게 탑람 디고 아주기 디고 시고와 당아주 아주 롭센디.
Good morning. We're continuing to look at the method for achieving happiness, happiness that is lasting and stable. And the Buddha Dharma presents the method of transforming our way of thinking, as opposed to what is regularly observed in the world, that of the accumulation of mere material comfort.
안에 간데 중국에 람나 아주 셈상한 레티네 셈감바 레티네 아주 동아리 연구를 셈상비 릭텔레티네 다 셈상보 계획 릭텔레티네 아주 디기 두고레스 되네 인자다 아주 셈상한기 예와 체제 다 셈감바 디게 시도 되자 콘동하게 로소바 딩엠베릭 다디 데소 안에 아주 이게 간스 메바 쇼고레 데소 규가를 했는데 이거레스 만주게 자위 규가레스 제도 언두스티네 심주 체제엔 한 자위 규디 나는 아주 매응외송 안데 메바 소비 토네 아주게 녀모바 세야디 셈memberik 세진 동아야 규디 바 세야체 다셈 상비릭디 안에 간스 주고 야게 간스 땅고레 디체바나 간스 땅고레스 두 심주 체제 제바 체제 안에 두스치는 셈 상비릭 야게 다쟁한 주기다 디기 주야기 안두스치나 탑람디 먼저 디고시 거다로와.
The method for achieving happiness through transforming our mind is to eliminate completely all unwholesome states of consciousness and cultivate ever stronger all wholesome states of consciousness. Or to use terminology we're more used to, eradicate all afflicted minds, destructive emotions, and cultivate virtuous minds. So how then does one go about eliminating the unwholesome ways of thinking? Well, first, one needs to recognize what the unwholesome minds are, what their cause is, and what their root cause is, the very root cause that all the afflictions come from. Having recognized that, then when one has identified the root cause, then one can apply the antidote to eradicate the root cause of all our suffering. And along with this, along with the methods for eradicating unwholesome states of consciousness, there are the methods for cultivating wholesome states of consciousness, cultivating virtuous minds. And this is the technique we're looking at in terms of how to achieve lasting, stable happiness.
아디네 자다 저기 뇽모바릭데 자와 카레레 중고레 시데다 뇽사 자와디 가레스네 다심마르 딘제 마릭바 세야딜레 디니 용고레스 지산 딘제 마릭바디 아주 뇽모바케게 되자 콘도 차상케게 규디티레스 델라테네 되자 콘도라소바케 되자던 콘도게 뇽모부 원게 가서 랭안 바사 안디기 랭안바디게 개와 치말량아 승아소케다 딘데 동아냐 규디 개와 치마 삼다 디 용고레 아니 가서 체델라 삼다베나 되자 콘도가 야라소바케 디원게 안나 두강아 망보 라센니가라 강가 용고레 디네사다 디니게 되자 콘도 뇽모로 개바나 디기 가서 탈바다 탐지키메 토발레 바시시겐데 디레 지산 디방구고레 메바수고레 디 메바수발라 신라마소나 자와디 고아치 메바 마수베네 강디와 제샤베네 야게 개용구로와 지산 디네자 아니 고 자와니 메바수고레 다 자와니 메바수고서 다신 말에 딘지 마릭바세디 자와니 메바수고 딘지 마릭바디 메바수고고레세 안도두스네 시고 송고로와 당서 딘지 마릭바디게 가르치고라스네 네 뇽모키 거르데 솔데네 아주 탈바데 차상하다 탈바토발 바르지바 차기로와.
Through the process that we've been looking at, we come to identify that the afflicted minds, these unwholesome states of consciousness, are what cause us to suffer both now and through the accumulation of non-virtuous karma. And all these afflicted minds come from the one root cause of the ignorance of self-grasping. From this ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in a way that it does not, all our other afflictions come: anger, attachment, pride, and so forth. And then from these, we accumulate the karmic causes that lead to suffering in future lives. In fact, it's these afflictions which are our primary obstacle to achieving liberation from suffering, freedom from suffering. Therefore, these afflictions must be eradicated, in particular, the root cause of these afflictions, the ignorance of self-grasping.
nganzu meba sui pangpa ina, an dele tene ane duasha kongto nyomo jia yo marwa, di meba me yondu liya ngamba saya meba. Chisan di do me yondu dan rangshin ji nganzu karli worsene, an jiga tarpa tabi gopang toya tang, tamji kimbe gopang toya, an diki chubya di yungurwa. Chisan tene yinzang di nyomongpa di pa ka shaba ina, di docho di, dan nganzu ke kiwi chawa di li yungurwa. 지난 디기 주비아디 그 강아 용의 유디 매바 세용도 디 도초다 디기 주비아 유디 라신지 그런 전이 내용으로 와.
It's good then to be really clear on this. When one eradicates the root cause of suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping, all the afflictions that follow from the ignorance of self-grasping, such as anger, attachment, pride, and jealousy, these do not arise again. So without any afflictions arising, one's not suffering. One is abiding in lasting, sustained happiness, a happiness that is not punctuated even by a moment of suffering. And this is how one attains happiness. Through eradicating the causes of suffering, one will not suffer. If one is not suffering, one abides in a state of mental peace that is lasting and stable, uninterrupted by even a moment of discomfort.
가사 다든 덴바드베지베 덴진 뇽몽에 자위 그 덴진디 빵바 매바 소발라 당가 동반이세 덴바 마주바데 또 후고라 동반이데 또 후고라 예제로하다 가상만도 디고셔 동니세 또 후고래 제자다 동니 또 후고래 동니 또 별로디 곰발레 때네 덴진디 매바스 빵고래 예제지 다 동니 또 후고래 예제지
To eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true grasping, as we looked at last night, we have to realize emptiness, the emptiness of true existence. This consciousness, the wisdom realizing emptiness, has to be cultivated.
다 동니 또 세대 동니 라비오도 가르치라고서는 가차 다 동동 세대 다들이야 림발 마선 동시 최전세 저 동서시 되네 동비가 동야게 가차 세 되네 강게 동비게 동이 세대 디숨레요로 당보 동시 최전 동서시 동시 최전세 지금 그래 다 디때도 가차데 파 까고 가차데 가차 까고 그래 가차데 까비게다 동바들라 동이서 가차 까베 동바들라 동이서로와 그래서 동이세데 강 가차 까서의 시치고로와 시치당벌 시치데 디때도 가차데 유메 제바 제제 가차데 디때도 까용도 데 가차데 동베 동이세데 리고레 제로와다 제산데 가샤당 가시체 가시디도 가샤데 까베 갈리그레스네 동반이 리고레 제레
In order to realize emptiness, one has to investigate and eradicate the object that is to be negated. So here, there is a couple of terms to introduce. There is a basis of emptiness, and there is the object of negation. When one investigates the object of negation to see whether it exists in the way that it appears or not, and realizes that it doesn't, and negates that object, then one comes to realize emptiness. So here there are two terms, the object of negation that we looked at last night, as well as then the basis for emptiness.
다데네자 다 동반이 가자데 지나 당보 가시체 당보 가시체 데네 가자체 데 가자디기 동백이 동인시로와.
Sorry, I made an error. I said basis of emptiness. I should have meant the basis of negation. So there's a basis of negation upon which one investigates the object of negation. So there's a basis of negation upon which one investigates the object of negation. Realizing that the object of negation does not exist, one realizes emptiness.
가시 라도 제바체스기 시디시오로 제바체시디 제바체스기 시디 가시시고래 다 디다 제바체네 가자디 디텐도 유메 세 제바체도 가자디 디텐도 유메 제바체 시디라 가시라고로와.
The basis of negation is the basis upon which one investigates. So it's the basis upon which one investigates. That's the basis of negation.
나인자다 안주기 다 당보 다 동반이 제바체 또바라 당보 가시 각자디 가서 로려야 차고 뭐 송고 그래서 가서 당가서 디고 쉬르와 제선 준주 첨바 답이 뭐라 말해봐 디용음에 지마인세 송로와 제선 가시디 뭐 마송바라 아니 디네게 디테도 제바체제 디도 미도 제바체 하고 두말 당보 가시디 디네질 가시 각자디 데니칠 레고레세 템바투바세 데니치레 세베글로야 뭐송고 그래서 제가 상관도 디고 쉬르와다. 뭐송고를 하고 그러와다. 니저 템바투바디 각자데 딩안저 뭐송고 그래서
As we looked at last night, the object of negation is true existence or inherent existence or existence by way of its own entity. And this is what appears to us. So the object that is to be negated is that which appears to us. But what is to be negated is true existence or existence by its own defining characteristics. This needs to be identified. This needs to be understood. The object of negation, true existence, needs to be recognized.
가자 덴버주바세 가자세 데다데 갑디는 저 가자데 덴버주바라 그러와. 제 덴버주바세 가네치레 라구이나 또 don달라 덴버주바세 요마레로와 요바이나 가네치 요고르라나 가마야 못되바 차셰당 근데 차셰다 유다 진 차셰 아니지 뢰파 샤바라 마되바 그런 지 데슬 마되바 지 예되바 있나 데네지 예바 있나 디 예바들라 데네지 예나 데라 가자 데바주발라 거래.
The object of negation is true existence. So here, just as the translator, just saying, in case I said last night the object of negation is the appearance of true existence, that's a slip of the tongue I make too often. The object of negation is true existence itself, which appears to mind, but the object of negation is not the appearance, it's true existence itself. So, if an object existed truly or inherently or by way of its own essence, how would it exist? It would be independent. And what does it mean for something to be independent? It would be independent of causes, independent of parts, independent of imputation by mind. So if something were to be established by way of its own entity, it would not require causes because it's established by its own entity. It doesn't require causes. It also doesn't require parts because it is naturally existent or truly existent. And it doesn't require imputation by mind because it exists by way of its own entity. So if something were truly existent, it would exist independently, meaning independence of causes, parts, and imputation by mind.
Denigi that Gala Matiopa, Lupa Shapalamba, Rang when you Trubadi, Deni Trubadi, Yorbe Yomarelan, Zaugini Yomar, Daddy. Yema Yomar Mahomba Yomar, Zaugini Mevardi.
There is no object that exists truly. There's no object that has ever existed truly. Since beginningless time up to this point, there's never been an object that exists independent of imputation by mind, causes, or parts. Nor will there ever be an object that is truly existent. Nor will there ever be an object that exists independent of imputation by mind, independent of imputation by mind, independent of causes or parts. There never has been, there never will be.
And the needs are the Nigi Gacha de Pa Gache, Manzuki, she, that Gashi Labna Nazuki, Gaza, Ngai, Tedo, Ngai, said the Gashi, Jebachi, Shidi, Nadi Shaje, Tito, Jebachena, Gacha Gavana, Gashi, the Nachagore. Then Hansing has a Nalmasaj, Susu Pumbola sometimes, Pumbo di Jebache, Gacha di Gabana, Pumbiti to Gabana, Gashi the Pumbo Chegor Gabashi. And in Anshin, Danganzuke, Jebache, Shidi, Josi di Shaje, Josi di Deniki, Tubare, Madagacha, Dinashichi, Moyu Tugure, Tugumindus, Jebache, Shidi, the Josi Chagashi, the Josi, Deniki, Gacha Guy di Gashitilla, Tamarangore, the Benangazo Kasan Shevanaji, Dumaj Namgasa, Tapas, your what Dumanam, the Nigi Gashi, the Dumaj Namgadi Shaje, Dumaj Namgadi, the Nigi Galaya, Matioba, and the Jig, Lupa Shabala, Matioba, Rangun, the Tuba, the Due, Mindus Chevachedu, Gabe Shidi, Gashi, Chevach Shidi, Dumaj Namgachagore.
The basis of negation is the basis upon which one engages in investigation. So let's take some illustrations of what a basis of negation would be, so as to understand this term clearly. If one was, for example, to investigate, if one was wondering, does this table exist truly? Does a table exist by way of its own entity? Then the basis of negation would be the table itself. Or if one was wondering, does the self exist inherently? Then the aggregates would be the basis of negation. One would investigate the aggregates to see whether the self existed truly or not. And to take George's question last night, if one was wondering, the permanent phenomenon that is space, uncompounded space, does this exist truly or not, inherently or not? Then, wondering whether space exists truly or not, then space is the basis of negation, because that is the object that is going to be investigated. And then one would investigate to see whether space, the basis of negation, exists independent of causes, parts, imputation by mind.
And then is that Gacha di Gala Cheshe, Gala, Matioba, Lupa, Shapala, Matioba, Rangung, and Trubdi, Zawagini Mevade, Meva and the Gawa Yomar was and the Benazuka, Labdu Yevaji Gawa, been the Churojo, the Chudipa, Yomaja Gapa, Chukaba, the Ladu, Chudi Yungo, the Chudi Yungo, is a Gawa, the guy or what. That in magic, Peninsula, me, Marja, and Louis, or the Mardi Gawa, said the Pagawa. Hawaligin Hapaka said, Yechi Gagurma, the Denny Mevan, Ga said the Tata Chagminduas and Big, Ga said, Meva like a scour, and Gawaya Minduas and Big, some long secret about them.
Last night, and a few segments ago, I mentioned that no phenomenon has ever existed by way of its own defining characteristics, nor will a phenomenon ever exist in this way. So then it's quite likely that one will wonder, but then why do we need to investigate and eradicate something that has never existed or will ever exist? Usually, if you want to eradicate something, or eliminate something, it would be something that does exist. It seems a bit counterintuitive to put all this time and energy into talking and thinking about and then eradicating something that not only doesn't exist now, but has never existed, nor will ever exist. So, for example, if one wanted to put a stop to say flowing water exists, so one would try to put a stop to it. But here we're trying to eradicate something that is said to have never existed. So this seems a little counterintuitive.
나디 다등한저 까고래세디 대신한저 숙진 까타나신 차교 말에 차이마 공원이 요 말와 제 숙진 까나선 취지 용의도 추가세디 숙진 까타데 다다 차교로와 거의 여바지 까고르마도 매바 까요 말로 다등한저 까세디 가리 까고래세네 롱을 바가고 롱을 가서 삼르기 유를 바가고 삼르 유나라 유를 이거와 제가 롱을 바가고 까야지 롱을 까고 그래 로기 모르세 로기 진디거와 디 진바데 매바서 거다 롱을 까세 디소르다 로기 유디 율리아 이거 로기 진디거와 제가 먼저 로 진디바나지 요 말에서 요 말에서 디 매바서 거래 제가 거래서 돼.
Generally, when we talk about eliminating or eradicating or ceasing, bring something to an end, we do so in relation to physical matter, such as flowing water. But that is not the kind of object that we're looking at here. The object of true existence or inherent existence is an object that only consciousness interacts with, an object that consciousness grasps at. So it is not a physical object that we're looking at bringing to an end, but something that the mind interacts with or the mind grasps at.
어디니 자다는 가사 쉬버리 다 지선 롱을 까는데 간스까고레 세대 당보는 줄야다 로르야 차르디 당한 지다 각시디 제바체세디 나세디 각베시 제바체세 시딩아 좀 나려야 삼다제 지상 가르 삼다나 지디고 이네 나지 디디도 제바체바나 또야 레라 요레스 뭐래 그 동시 최징이 또비 또야 레라 요레스 거 디네 자당한도 제바치세 나 세데 삼다 나서 나세 소소는 나세 저와 델레 제바치 삼다도 당한도 가사 셰반 나시리 이제 가서 나 세데 당보 간스 침슈 각자디 간스 뭐스 로르야 간스 리그도 로르야 간스 난구도 나주 심죽 제오레스 지산 디네 제데 갑로도 지나가도 나 세데 소소야 로르야 간스 난구도 나한테 간스 난구도 심죽 제데 당가서 가지 가샤리아 가샤 뭐 손탕기 당보 삼다타디 가상 셰바로 아마도 디루 거로와 제산 각시 다디 각시로와 제산 각시디 다리로와 제산 다디레데 나 세디 간스 난구도 제산디 제바치 다시디 나시 나디 다시 차고로와 가서 각시 각베시디 다리 차고로와
It was mentioned last night that one is encouraged to start with investigating the self because of our great familiarity with our sense of self. It's said to be an easier object to realize. So the basis of negation then would be the self. And then when the basis of negation is the self, it's the self then that one investigates, to investigate if it exists in the way that it appears or not. So one then, the starting point is to come to see how, on the basis of negation, the object of negation appears to the mind. Object of negation being true existence, how does this appear to the mind? How does the truly existent self appear to the mind? This is the starting point. And then it's this, thereafter, that one investigates. So first, one needs to see how the self appears to the mind. And then one engages in the investigation to see if the self exists in the way that it exists, if it exists in the way that it appears or not.
Do sometimes nga setting sociology and nangidu do sometimes dangadi pung sosigi pumbo da 소식이 샘다 풍보라 강라에 마되바 뢰파 샤바라 마되바 호롱원에 유대바 로시 능고다 딘낭에디 템버주바 나수디리 디 템나수디리다
We start out by coming to get a feel for how the self or the I appears. The way that it appears is as if our sense of self is something independent of the body, independent of mind. And this is an appearance of true existence. The self appears to us as being truly existent, meaning independence of what? Parts such as its body or the body and mind. And also it appears to be independent of imputation by mind. So the self appears as if it doesn't require imputation by mind to exist, hence truly existent.
오다 나디 오디나 신시 능고란 다 디니 낭수디 디니게 세부 하고 왔지 당보디 디니 능도와 세베 세부 하고 왔지 데나 하고서는 하 딩을 송제 디나시 나와 나시 나디다 다 가와도 쓰는 안 중에 제바셔야 되다 제바셔야 돼 제고거다
The first step then is to recognize how the self appears. When one gains a clear appearance, or one comes to recognize how the self appears to us, to consciousness, then one starts to search for such a self, search to see if the self exists in the way that it appears to consciousness.
제바 되게 나와나 인가디 가와도 상황을 소설 때도 제바 제고로와 제바 지도가로 소수기 때도 제여도 나와도 여야데 당부 풍보되는 셈니여로와다 제당부 풍보의 라바 셈다 풍보이 진 라바 셈 풍보되서 나저 라바체 다 내가 그러와 되게 나세 강라 모두바 그런 차시에다 뢰파 샤발라 규단진 차시 뢰파 샤발라 마투 그런 원이 유방하지 능고래 니나와나지 가디다 소시 풍부에도 가와도 셰바체 지자 디네 자도 풍부에도 셰바치도 네 풍부에도 가와도 지자 풍부디 네 풍부세디 샤차 바바 루고 망부 지게 좀 대화를 차기도 난 지직직래 땜바 땜돼봐지 대수이나 풍부디 아니 지금 깨지기지 파 유어로 되게 다보 됐어요 제가 지금 먼저 충분히 체체체체 마선 풍부하면 유어로 되게 유어로도 왔어 제자데 풍부세야 돼야 아니 지 차사디디나는 좀 매나 아니 풍부 차이민도 매만장 풍부세야 돼 현현 유단见了对呢解吧기지기지 유어로 해봐 아니 지게 펜춘 망고실을 뛰어 되게 직례샤스 제가 네 풍부디 나려야 나세의 강라야 마되바 유단진 차시 뢰파 샤발라 마되 강라야 마되바 랑응원의 주바 나와 나신티 네 풍보의 레멘도스 안도시의 풍보의 가서는 풍보의 유단진을 되고도 풍보의 유어 주고도 제가 될래야 아는 안 저기 발뢰 샤발라 되고도 와스베 도스 제바치디 풍보의 때도 되네 가디 라기오 말도 이토고 말해
Punkoti vacotak mare. Jecem čami da sam to. Jecem punkoti vacotak mare. Tamare lamna jugo da ditin da nigyo mare sedi only. When one investigates the self, one starts with investigating one's own self, not that of someone else, one's own self. So I mentioned the first step is to see how our sense of self appears to our mind, and this is as being truly existent, which means it's independent, meaning it doesn't require causes, parts, or imputation by mind. It's independent of these things. That's how it innately or naturally appears to us. So if it exists this way, it should be findable. If the self is something that's independent of anything else, that exists by way of its own essence, then such a self should be findable. And the place where it would have to be found is amongst the aggregates. So starting with the form aggregate, one investigates where is this self amongst the body, the self that is independent of anything at all. When we investigate our body, whether in its individual parts or collectively as a whole, it's very clear to us that our body changes momentarily. And its momentary change comes about in dependence on a wide number of causes and conditions, and the body is comprised of innumerable parts. So how can this body be the self? A self which is independent of parts, independent of causes. Moreover, one requires mental imputation onto the body. So how can one, again, so all these characteristics of an independent self are not fulfilled by the physical aggregate, by the body. So this then is the first place of investigation, the coarser level, that of coming to see if the independent self can be found in the body, and one sees that the requirements of a truly existent self are not fulfilled by the physical aggregate. Therefore, it cannot be our sense of self, our I.
제산도 삼다된 안주 풍보디 유단见了对吧的你这个给这풍보给这俺们起码的给这俺们的对的这个实际上풍보的유단见了对吧平均切下来吧对吧给这俺去了对吧俺那配略下吧了对吧这下身边三大的풍보的电这个运这个电这三当过了吧实际上变得유단 균 아마 균을 때네 개와르샤 계징 아마를 때네 개와르스는 균직이 때네 삼당고 제자다 풍보셔야 될래 파 뢰파 되네게 차시면 뭐 초발 파 뢰파 다바시래샤세도 나 때네 다바스 때네 다바 때네 삼도 되네게 풍보디 때네게 때네 다바 풍보들이야 뢰파 풍보래서 달고로 차시면 뭐 좀바되네 풍보 생애 숙세 달고로 봐 뢰파 달고로 봐 지전 차시면 뭐를 때네 뢰파 숙세 달고로 봐 제자 때네 다바 제자 풍한도 풍부의 때도 윤직이 때네다 때네 답에 때지게 남샤 두신 삼당여도 제자다 제자 풍부되다 되네게 때제샤 때제 저와 현래 때네 주바시래샤 제가 현래对呢主播略怕大把了对吧的下是每个什么当有的제가 다我是那完现在刚来没对吧店呢也切下来没对吧语言来没对吧略怕大把了没对吧现在我的碰波的我这个民族啊就是我了那完那些我的这个民族这民族但碰波的都了那完那些我的碰波的都了也民族写的哦的那个三大的电这个南下三大些还活着
It's good to be clear on the investigation, because this ideally is an investigation one needs to engage in regularly. We tend to associate our body and with our self, our sense of self. We have a strong, our identity is tied up with our body. So now let's come to see, in this investigation, we're coming to see if that is valid or not, if it's in accordance with reality or not. So the starting point is to see how the self appears to us, which, as has been mentioned, is independent or truly existent. And then to see if that such a self then is if the body represents that self. And one can see very quickly that it cannot be, because the body is very clearly dependent on a wide number of causes and conditions. It's comprised of so many parts. It changes momentarily and is dependent on imputation by mind to be called my body. So in this way, through utilizing the presentation of dependent arising, dependence on causes, dependence on parts, dependence on imputation by mind, we come to see that the body is dependently arisen. And the self, which appears to be independent, so not a dependent arising but independent, therefore cannot be the body, cannot be associated with the body, because independent and dependent are contrary. So therefore, we come to the conclusion that despite our sense of self-identity and our physical aggregate, our body, being so entwined, There is no basis in logic or reasoning for this. Our body cannot be our self, our I, because our body is clearly dependent on causes, on parts, and on imputation by mind. So the self that appears to us to be independent cannot be our body, because such a self is contrary to our body. Such a self cannot be found in our body.
nga sa de nga lo le na wa na xin nga de re mi phung bo de re mi da phung bo de ne ye mi du me ni ba za phung bo de nga ma res da na ga re yor sun da na se mi den de je wo da phung bo de ne ye me na da nga de lo le na wa na xin nga di da se mi de du se mi de je de da de je ba je wo se go ba du shi de ji ba de se mi de je ta de ya sem se de dian jin zhe wa ju sam dang wo le sem se de ge jing ma chi le dian de jun wa and this getting a madding chimal timber chimading amal in the gulet in the chigore. So that the niggy same delay, same na, same jo rigmangbo, the niggy mangbo soba, the niggy soba yobata. Delay luipa, tiger yobata. Same delay, be yodu yoba, gigi, Gabriele, same Sambolia, Gabriele, same Gambalia, just Gabriele, same deal, ben somebody on the cutie, Gabriele Meva chat, Gabriele control same last on the cutie, Gabriele Meva chat, just a yodu yote. Just the same the corona, good and gentle do, what you among do, just a carriage you are same. Maybe control China, Carolina Jambi, same Jimondo, Shuchimatana, control my delatin about Nuba Yamdrada. Young James and I tell you, young Corachi is Chico 200 Curada. The Nikita, Gish Angela doing Yungu to us. The names are same said the Shalatin Yungu Baza, Malia now an ashing Adi, Jenda, Chasha, Kalaba, Shabala, Rangun, Drubar. Then he can't matter was Nangore. Now an ashing is 70 remedua, 70 getting actually do, and ticket Topala do, and the young of the Yule do, usually dinner, and the Chapatia, and Horonayada, and then he turned Mango chili dinner to do a Chesa. That's empty. Same getting, said in Mindus, now an ashing had the Mindus, Chesang is same day, Pumbo and same day, Chesa said. 大仙这位车呢，落了那完的，你看这早就呢，民都上边什么东西离过了的。
Not only do we tend to have our sense of self-identity in our body, have these entwined, but so too with the mind. We've already then investigated whether the self that appears to us as being independent is the body, and we see that it cannot be found anywhere within the body at all. So then one goes to a subtler level and then looks at consciousness, because our sense of self is also very tied up with our thoughts, with consciousness, confusing individual thoughts or the consciousness as a whole with our self. So if that is correct and it's not a confusion, this independent self, this truly existent self, should be found within consciousness. So then one embarks on investigation into the mental aggregates. Following the investigation for the truly existent self in the body aggregate, or the physical aggregate, we now come to the mental aggregates. And here, again, we can see that the mind cannot be the self which appears to be independent, because existing by way of its own essence means it exists by way of its own essence. It doesn't require causes, parts, or imputation. But mind very much is, or individual minds are very much dependent on causes, parts, and imputation. For example, independence on encountering a particular object, a particular consciousness arises. We get angry when we encounter certain situations. When those situations pass, so too does anger. If we generate bodhicitta, then bodhicitta is generated. Before it wasn't. So therefore we see how mind changes independence on causes. Independence on a particular meditation, bodhicitta is generated. And when bodhicitta is present, anger is not going to arise within us. But when our bodhicitta has dissipated, and we encounter a particular object, anger again arises. So we see this instability with our mind, whereas the self appears so stable, independent of causes. But our mind, we see how it is so influenced by causes. Our sense of self appears to be independent of parts, but our mind is comprised of so many parts, moments of consciousness, a previous moment, a present moment, future moments. Moreover, mind requires imputation by mind. One consciousness imputes onto another. So therefore, all the characteristics of a truly existent self, none of these can be found within consciousness. So therefore, when one seeks a truly existent self within consciousness, within mind, cannot be found.
Dine zadelia di sundwa, jisan denigi gacha ngoni gi juba shane di tongba dang se gacha ngoni juba shane di tongba dang se de da khasan di ma di ruang zo.
And this is where we got up to last night. So last night we got to the top of page 6 and the first sentence. Rather, when we speak of a phenomenon as being empty, we are referring to its being empty of being established by way of its own entity, its own inherent existence.
Jisan daten nganzu shide gacha ngoni juba se de nganzu gansa ge de cheba chi ki shi ro jisan gansa de nga se so so lo na yo de个见的刚来嘛对吧？略怕下巴嘛，让我们的主巴那对吧？让我们的主巴那那心，让我们的主巴的家下的些我你主巴，都接吧接就是干呀嘛就的那个那些早的没吧的没接吧都接去的刚什么之类的那个那心几个刚来嘛对，让我们的主巴略怕下巴了，让我们的主巴的。这个东巴的民族身边东山经一个人是呢，的那个东山的东巴也是个也是个人的东巴当时的。
Seeing that our self appears to us as being established by way of its own essence, remembering essence and entity are synonymous. So the self appears to be established by way of its own essence, its own defining characteristic, meaning that it appears to be independent, not influenced or requiring causes, parts, or imputation by mind. When one seeks such a self that has been established by way of its own essence, one cannot find it. One finds that a self established by the self is empty of being established by way of its own essence. In other words, such a self doesn't exist at all. It cannot be found. Here then, when one realizes that the self doesn't exist in this way at all, therefore it is empty of being established by way of its own entity. And that is where one comes to realize emptiness, realizing the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears.
Dine chile dos chinanga zo tongyi ge jeba che thang de dine jeba che dos tiante ge so tiante ge sam phungbo de gyudan jian xian la de ba lui pa sha ba de ba sam da dine ma zo sem de ya jiao ka sa ge jing ma da gyu le de ba ge jing a xi le dian ba mong bo le cuo ba dine pa lui pa de le xie ba se pa sem se lui pa da ba dine ge de ba chi le xia sin dine ge tiante ge nam xia sam da den ge tiante ge nam xia sam da na da je 난 대신 아주 나요도 나야들라 강라에 맞대봐 뢰 샤발라 랑 코로 수강라 맞대고 코로 많이 주바 여바지 나요도 딩이디다 퉁기되면도 삼다 제가 딩이 맞춘 바인자 된디게 로라 나와 시디다 나주게 셈이 된데 요마 퉁겨 말에 풍부된데 퉁겨 말에 제가 셈이 된데 니야메 풍부되 니야메래 매바자 셈디야 된디게 나와 나시 다고 주요 말에 되네 류디야 데니게 나와나시 다리고 주요마 데네엔사 다 치료를 소수게 셈다 류니샤데 치료 받다버네 대고요요 말와 제가 데네사 딩아주 두치데 소수 나와나시 다리다 소수게 류다 소수게 셈 가도야 주요 딩고 주미도 다 치료기 도다 신라서바다 디고 주야고요 말 데네지도 다 친한 강을 때베네 수술로 나와 나신 다디 나세 나와 나가 술로 나와 나신 나디스마도 나메여라고 말다 랑게 로라 대신 나와 나신지 나디 자유니 민두 새벽에 디게 동배 동사지로리아 차 리교를 진짜 디니게 동사들라 동반이라고 그래서 제가 저다 돈다 닝보디 디송거와
First step of the meditation was coming to see how the object, in this case the self, appears to the mind. Then in the process of investigation, one utilizes the skillful technique of dependent arising in order to come to realize emptiness, the emptiness of the object existing in the way that it appears. One uses the three forms of dependent arising, that of dependency on causes, dependency on parts, and dependency on imputation by mind. And one comes to see that the object does not exist in the way that it appears. In fact, the way that it appears is completely contrary to how it exists. So therefore, it's impossible for the self to either be independent as well as dependent. These things are contradictory. It cannot be both. When one looks, one sees there is no independent self because it cannot be found. In the investigation, one first comes to see how the self appears, and then one seeks it. Where does one seek? Not out in the forest, but here within the aggregates. If the self exists in the way that it appears, it's not going to be amongst the trees, it's going to be here, either within our body, within our mind, or the two of them. Then we investigate. And when we come to realize that every object appears to our consciousness as if it exists truly. And then when we investigate that object, we realize it does not exist in this way at all. So when we investigate, we see that the self that appears to us as being truly existent or existent by way of its own essence, it cannot be found in our body. And in fact, our body doesn't have a truly existent essence either. When we investigate the self then amongst our mental consciousness, we cannot find it in our mental consciousnesses either, as was mentioned in the previous segment. Moreover, our mental consciousnesses, individually and collectively, whilst appearing to us as being truly existent, these too also lack true existence. And likewise with all phenomena, whether outer phenomena or inner thoughts, all appear to us as being truly existent, as being independent, as existing by way of their own essence, but none of them exist in the way that they appear at all. No phenomenon does. When one realizes that, one comes to realize the pure empty state, one comes to realize emptiness. So this, in brief, is the essence of the meditation that leads to the realization of emptiness.
digi dugu se de nga digi dugu re nga ji chue che gore nga nyam len che gore she ga yo nga khoro min duas ji sa de nga yo mare be se de jiwa chi li gore da.
Then this brings us to the last part of the meditation, which answers the question, having investigated and sought the self and come to realize that the self that appears to me cannot be found and therefore does not exist, does that mean I do not exist at all? Because the self that I sought does not exist at all. So do I not exist at all? If I don't exist, well, I don't need to worry about future lives. No chance of me falling to the lower realms if I don't exist. No point in striving for enlightenment, because there is no self to go to enlightenment. Enlightenment wouldn't exist. Lower realms won't exist. Nothing exists. That is then a doubt that is likely to come.
Nga yo maribe lamna, nga yo maribe sedu nga de la da, de shi nga zu lo la na wa na shi nga ti yo maribe sene di yo mare se. 당아 세야지 지당 하세 요래서 간지 요래서 뢰파 따바 좀 요래서 뢰파 샤바 뢰파도 뢰 풍보를 파 따바 좀 뢰파 따바 좀 요래서 제가 로라 나와나신 강라야 마트바 랑응의 뢰파 따바 마이면 강라야 마트바 랑응의 줍도 나와나신가디 요마레스 안은 가가서는 차시를 뛰바 현실을 뛰는 뢰파 따바 좀 요마레스 하죠 차시를 뛰어봐, 류파 따봐 좀 해봐 했어.
In that first part of the meditation, with its many steps, starting with how the self appears and then the investigation for it, concludes with the realization that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. It's empty of being independent, empty of being truly existent or existent by way of its own essence. Doesn't exist in that way that it appears to mind at all. That self doesn't exist. Nevertheless, though, now we come to the last part of the meditation. The self does exist. It doesn't exist in the way that it appears to mind, but it does exist. The way that it exists is independent on parts, independent on imputation by mind, independent, it exists as a dependent arising, dependent on imputation by mind onto the basis of the physical and mental aggregates. That is how the self exists. But that is not how the self appears to the mind. The self appears to be independent, but it actually exists as dependent, as a dependent arising, dependent on imputation by mind. So therefore, the self that doesn't exist is the one that innately or naturally arises to us. That doesn't exist at all. But the self as a mere imputation by mind, that does exist. So the self exists dependently, not independently.
지상 데네기 제바치제 동반이 또용도 동반이 또 차네 데네 제라 동반이 또 차위 제라 는 삼르스타도 나 세데 뢰파 따바점이도 세비게 따로 나 세데 로라 나와 나신지 민도 따로 뢰파 샤바점이 따바점이도 세다고 그러다.
Therefore, the second step of the meditation follows the realization of emptiness, the realization that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. And this part of the meditation, one recognizes that the self, however, does exist, but exists as a mere imputation by mind. So one has realized the self doesn't exist independently, but here one realizes that the self does exist, but dependently, dependent on imputation by mind.
데네게 동이 또 차위 제라 가라하고 그러시네 대신가 좀 나세도 로를 파수 나도 강라야 마도 랑응원이 줘봐 뢰파 见变차셰당 뢰파 샤발라 마도 코롱원이 줘봐 로를 나와나 능고래 나와나 신가도 데네시도 선비 로시 용고래 로한지 줘로 와다 이 덴진르와 제산 디 덴진디다 코 노트이샤 로로셰샤 로셰레샤다 코 노트레샤 선비게 신하고 그래 그래서 그걸로 로시인바 하고 너트이마 하고도 다 코에 심바나 신지 자와기네 요 말했어. 로디기 나와나 로디기 나와나신 자와기네 요 말해. 선비기 삼나기에도 로디 로시인바 하고 그래. 되네 진짜 로디기 누범에 봐 차고 그래. 그래서 로델라 되네 안에 되샤 공도 녀모 봐야요. 용거 말해.
Having realized that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, it does not exist independently, independent of parts, causes, and thought, one recognizes that the consciousness that grasps at the self as existing in this way is a wrong consciousness. It's an ignorance, because it's believing that the object, in this case the self, exists in a way that is contrary to reality. Believes that the self exists in a way that is contrary to how it exists. Therefore, it is a wrong consciousness. Recognizing this, the ignorance of true grasping loses its strength. Recognizing that the consciousness that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears is contrary to reality. It's a wrong consciousness. Recognizing this, that consciousness loses its strength, and therefore the resulting afflictions, such as anger and attachment, will not arise.
And then the Niki Jeba Cheta, that Nale Chiki Konyamyoska, that this Tony Toya, the Kaus Yomarwa, Tangi, the Geshe Thubten, the Niki Pigeon Lobby, that the Niki Jeba Cheta, within the Snanko said that my Chiki Amchona, Goyodi, Tubadi, Nanganzuki, Pa, Tiklagoma, Dodiati, Nigi, Jebache, Dozi, Yamyon Tone, Shiaskayoma, the Shigoma, the
That then is how to engage in the meditation on emptiness. This is something that I have to say, I don't have any experience of myself, but this is how I've been taught by my remarkable teachers, and I've also read about this practice or this meditation in many authentic texts.
Da delia pe nyanga chimbo shi uchi yore so da chi dinik cheba chi pe yana chetal huya yana taktal huya gi dinik cheba chi ne ane lamro yaku ma ju na kabrile chetal hu gore kabrile taktal hu gore chesa dinik delia cheba cheta dele de nyanga shi yor se ore.
This process of investigation based on knowledge has to be done precisely, because there is a grave danger associated with this meditation. And that grave danger is that the practitioner can all too easily fall into one of the two extremes, either the extreme of nihilism or the extreme of rarefication.
Nga se zao kini minduwa sempe, ta nga mindu sempe samsili gore, chetar hungo de, nga mindu sempe ki. Ta nga me na, nga sanje kubang toya mare, chezan da, jewa chima toya mare, chezan dusi za, ta nga me na, jikbar shanda chezan gansa, chezan jikbar wa nga diyo mare, konzo la nga yo mare, chezan me wan za, ta sanje kubang toya mindu, jewa chima le nyude mindu sempe ki, dine ki nyanga cheli ko samtang sa lamdru ma juba ina, cheta lungje ane dusjene lamru jiking loktakiye nyanga yonsi gore andi membege da ngaju da samtan ha di ngaju phungbe de chue kare samtan jidan jothang de jibare samtan odadi chue ga ya mindu a sembege da cheta sa de dinile ge nyanga yungore seje.
Should one engage in this meditation and fall into this danger of adopting the view of nihilism, then this wrong consciousness, the view of nihilism, presents grave danger. So one will come to the realization in the meditation that I do not exist. And remembering that every object appears to us as truly existent, when one investigates, one recognizes that no object exists truly. So therefore one recognizes that the object of the self doesn't exist truly, and believes the self doesn't exist at all. If the object is karma, one's investigating cause and effect. One comes to realize it doesn't exist truly, and then thinks karma doesn't exist at all. Or liberation or enlightenment, when that's the object that's investigated and recognizes that that too doesn't exist truly. If then one falls into the extreme of nihilism, one will believe there is no liberation to strive for, no enlightenment to strive for. And hence there's such grave danger from this wrong consciousness that is the extreme of nihilism, starting from the belief that I do not exist, then also believing nothing exists. There's no karma, there's no liberation, no enlightenment. And this is a grave danger.
Desa dine du cheba chide da du sine nga se de yang chi nga se de me ba na zao ine dia yo ma re sing ha de yo go re ji sang da sang ji go ba top tar ba top ge wa nga che sam da nga de yo go re ma do nga de me ba de zao ine ji ma re dine hin sang nga se de den de yo re se cheba che che pho ku chi dang kwang chu ge nga ji sha yong de kabla dine cheba che che nga ji ni ne sha yo de den da ta cha ro go re da ta sha ro.
On the other hand, should one investigate, but actually come to a conclusion that I have found the truly existent self. I have found the illustration of the self, or I have found the self that exists by way of its own characteristics, its own essence. Thinking that you have found something that is the self, that is independent from anything at all, one falls now into another extreme, the extreme of rarefication. And one would believe that this truly existent self is the self that will somehow go on to liberation or potentially fall into the lower realms.
tarba sanji goba tobiki tawa goba toile tawa di gongogorwa tarba tone tawa di gongogorwa 제자디 tawa nande ta tawa tardu de chade gorwa 제자다 denigi gomya tawa di gomya di dongbani gomya dongbani dobelo de ta tawa tardu gacha kai tawa tardu chego dile la jinga zo dan namba sanji bigi dinya tawa dongbani gomse de denishile dile la wa ju gomya me bare do.
Whilst there is this grave danger of falling into either of these extremes of nihilism or rarefication, nevertheless, this view that is presented in the middle between the two, this is the supreme view, the ultimate or final view. There is no higher view that has been taught than this. This is an indispensable realization to gain liberation from samsara, an end to suffering and pain.
안데네 나데네 장하 저기 동반이기 되니게 제바체 냠는 제발이야다 딱 지금 저기 기회신이 땡고고세데 계침부터 작으로 와든지 마 랍된 어디치도 된데 용어를 다 디제디 마치 랍된 쟁 고고래 엔디멘베랑 저기야 지금 라마다 이담리야 대바다 안베 대바 템보시에 안델이야 안지게 초사 집장만 고고인서와다 되니게 저기 되니게 초사 집장 세야지 양 저기 되니게 망부 고고래 제가 되니게 몰람다 대바다 라마다 이담래 대바체 안 대바체지도 체 된델이야 안 동바이 마노바 마추바지 또야게 돈달이야 안 최고부야다 안 딕 소자 사장 제바 디바사야 디바자야다 개와사야 라서바 안도시네 안 제네 안에 띵만 저기 동바이디 또 제바체 또 호야 돼 된듯이 용이 있어라다.
In order to gain realization of the strength required so as to attain liberation, as well as then to progress sequentially through the required stages, it's indispensable that one is under the care and guidance of a qualified spiritual mentor. Moreover, one needs to have stable trust in one's teacher, as well as the Buddhas and one's Yiram. And in addition to having stable trust in one's Lama, one needs to engage in the extensive accumulation of virtue and purifying of non-virtue. And then fourthly, one also needs to make strong heartfelt prayers for inspiration, strength, and skill in one's application.
지단 시시제 안 지진 제메할래 니기 동반이 따와 우메 따와디 니 하고에데 우메 따와 따다리도 레면도 쓰네 야 제메양의 쉬도 지진 제메양이 따다리면도 당보처럼 소사 집자 제고래서는 야참 조고래서는 야 소사 집자 제제 제고래서는 제르무체 안지 폐제 안지게 동샤 다 되네기 전에 차금 자다 되네기 차 망보제 되네 나전에 초사 집자제 제비게 안 되네 전에는 동반이게 따와데 만노와시 예바래 사실 되네기 남나나데 되네 여러와 되네자디 돈달라 가르스무선 알아서 랍자 날 동반이 세도데 레로 요 말에 지상 갈래 망보 잡지야 초사 집자제 라말리아 대바 망보 제호레스 초사 집자 델야 동반이고 제바제 두스 숭데르 조마도 초사 집자 기네 마제바제 아당아 동반이 양양 3단계에서 3단의 또 투마레시르 다가젤레 만도 자데 남로 푸와라 쇼바니 고고레스 지상 쇼바 지기 풀투고 말해서 지상하다 동반이 공부에 초사고 말에 차세고 말에 지치고 풀고 말에 다 동반이 겁는 디기를 선배 삼단에 동반이 또 두고 말해 지상들이야 동반이 또야 된다래 차세야 추고 풀야 안지가 라마 대 이담을 소왔다야 안도시는 쇠는 먹고 싸고 그래서 지금 안들이야 랍자로 차고로 와
Great practitioners such as Lama Tsongkhapa, even for such a practitioner, he had to make extensive effort in order to realize emptiness. He came into this life with so much merit that he had direct visions of Manjushri, directly perceiving Manjushri as directly as we perceive each other. But despite having all this merit, when he asked Manjushri once, "Have I come after all these years to realize emptiness correctly?" Manjushri said, "No, still not. You need to accumulate further merit, and in conjunction with this, you need to purify obstacles." Having been given this direct advice, then Geshe Rinpoche made extensive effort to accumulate merit and purify negativities through practices such as offering mandalas, making prostrations, and so forth. So what we need to take away from this is that not just the mere acceptance of the statement that it is difficult to realize emptiness, but understand that to eradicate a wrong consciousness that we have had continuously since beginningless time, as manifesting continuously since beginningless time, will take sustained effort. And not merely trying hard, but it needs to be reinforced, empowered by accumulation of vast stores of merit, as well as purification of negativities. One needs both wings, the method side practices, including purification and accumulation, as well as the wisdom side, the cultivation of the wisdom realizing emptiness. All of these are required in order to progress well.
난디네게 레다 동반이자 데 주게다 깔레 카쇼 가지디 다 차상기 돈다 닝보데 도나마 송바이나다 던주나네 송바이나다 돈다 닝보데 하고 고야이디 조디 동반이자 데 땡아지 기셰디 디레다 돈 조디레.
What has been presented then this morning is the essence of the view of the Buddha Dharma and the meditation in how to come to realize it within oneself.
디네 인자다 가지네 델리아 아다 디네 깔레 카고네데 또 투사마레 삼삼제 제나다 아주 로라 shum바르 제나데 디고 마르바다 가주 아다 디네기 소소라기 가요 지용게 삼라다 제바라 제 디네 제베이나 곧 도야리아 타녀는 주고로와 제사 디네 자다 주기 디네기 삼다야다 디네기 제 고합 빼면서 가와서 보시고 제거로 받아 동반이 녀몽 빠야게 자위 다제 마링 빠데데 년부 대기 니 초들어 가지고 로바 디 초제 델파 안 고를 주제 자야게 고주데 제바제 고를 주데 대빼마시기 디다 뽑아기고야 당 고합마서 빼야고 휴지를 에서베게 소소 가와 공고에 제거로 받아.
Having said that, though, don't fall prey to the wrong understanding that if this is so difficult to achieve and that the great practitioners have to endure such hardship for so long, that this must be beyond someone ordinary like me. This is a mistake. This is a mistake. All great beings were once ordinary like us. And the way they became remarkable is through continuing day after day, placing one foot in front of the other, gathering knowledge, reflecting on that knowledge continuously, and doing so repeatedly over a sustained period. Then one will come to gain ever greater clarity on how the object of negation appears to us, come to understand and recognize true existence. As one comes to understand the object of negation or recognize the object of negation ever more, one will then, through one's continued efforts, have ever more success in applying the antidotes, and then coming to weaken our grasping at true existence. So here, I really encourage you not only now but regularly generate joy in the causes you have all individually accumulated, so as to have met these teachings, so as to have the intellectual capacity to understand them, so as to have the capacity to integrate what you understand. We all have this capacity. Recognize this, take joy in that, and generate strength of mind, a courageous outlook, that this is not beyond any of us.
That was the Sha Sha Shuga de Sha, and that was some tide, the Shevana Duchinis and de Sha. Yeah, that isn't the shading for the year last one.
So thank you. We'll conclude for this morning here. So Tsepel, if you could lead the dedications. Thank you.